Dark fertility. When Nick asked me if I wanted to speak, I wasn't sure what I wanted to talk about. And I started thinking about myself, my own identity, and then the identity of women, and how so much throughout history, women have been associated with fertility, and our identity has been tied to fertility. So I figured, let's explore this dark, dark topic. And don't worry, there's no videos or sound effects to this presentation. So if we look back at history, let's think about ancient times. There was a god for everything. Doesn't matter if you look at Egyptian history or Roman or Greek or Indian, there was a god for everything, different purposes. And sometimes you'd get the standard, god of fertility. But as I started to research and explore, I discovered there's some really specific duties that gods, let's say, exercised. So there are things like goddess of fertility, rainbows, agriculture, rain, and beer. That's great. I mean, if I was a god, I'd probably be like, oh, yeah, I'll take those. And you know what? I like beer. Throw that in too. And then there's god of fertility, reproduction, and I'm not lying, lettuce. So I don't know what the archaeologist who found this was thinking, but whatever that image was, they're like, oh, yeah, this is definitely lettuce, not harvest. Every other description is, oh, yeah, god of fertility and harvest. This one, no, this is very specifically lettuce. So interesting. And then we start to get a little bit darker. So goddess who enables penetration. So very specific task and responsibility here. The god who subdues the bride to the husband's will. Okay, we're starting to see power and control come into play. The goddess who unties the girdle of the bride. More power, more control. The snake god or goddess associated with rainbows and the fertility and erections of the tribe's shaman. So there were tribes in various different cultures where only the shaman could impregnate women. So, imagine this, you have a husband and a wife and they want to have a child and the husband's like, all right, well, I'll drop you off with the shaman. I mean, do I need to take you twice a week, 3 times a week? How long is this going to take? Interesting process. But it's a lot of power put into the hands of religious leaders. Then there's the goddess who holds the bride down on the bed. And we've seen this come into play in Handmaid's Tale. And the goddess of lactation. This popped up a number of times as well. So we start to understand what was society's attitude towards fertility. Fertility was very important. And women were essentially the vessel, and they were to be controlled so that fertility and the future could be controlled. So when we think about fertility, we think about the definition of womanhood, fertility and the oppression of womankind, and you cannot ignore the dangers of patriarchy and power. I don't need to get into the details of how women have been treated in society, how they've been controlled, how they've been oppressed, and how fertility has been the focal point for that oppression. We're very fortunate in Canada. I can't even say North America because we have a lot of choice here and we have a lot of empowerment. But there are a lot of parts in this world where women still don't have the rights and control over fertility. That's the dark history and the dark present. So why wouldn't the future be dark? We're all here for dark futures. You must like darkness or are intrigued by it or are drawn to it. So I'm assuming you read dystopian novels or watch dystopian film. And what do we often see as a focal point in dystopian media? It's the end of humankind. And what is more shocking about the end of humankind than the end of fertility? How often have we seen the theme of fertility pop up in dystopian novels and film? And they pop up in different ways. In The Matrix, you have your machine city of embryos. The Giver is a great example. This black and white world where everyone is prescribed a role, what they're going to contribute to society. They don't get to really choose who they're with, what they do for a living. There are certain people that are designed to give birth. There's others that are nurturers. And if you're not a perfect child, what happens? You are released, as they say in The Giver. Released means the death sentence. So in this story, you see Jonas trying to save his little brother, pseudo-brother Gabe, because he's not a perfect baby. This is what happens in what starts off as a utopian world and then turns into a dystopian story. You have children of men. The world is about to end because nobody's fertile anymore, nobody's giving birth, and then there's one woman who's pregnant, who's bearing child. And the world is at war to steal her, to protect her, to make her their own. We have Blade Runner, the bounty hunters. Who's better, the androids, the replicants, or the humans? This is a battle between the future us. Gattaca. Gattaca is all about eugenics. It's about ideal DNA, perfecting DNA, and only allowing perfect DNA to have rights. Anyone else does not qualify. They're the valids and the invalids. And then, of course, Handmaid's Tale. Before this show came out, I had decided to reread the novel, and I'd read it back in high school. And I remember reading it in high school and thinking, okay, well, it's really dark, but it's so far-fetched. I just can't imagine this happening because my reality, my Canadian upbringing and reality did not imagine something this dark happening. And then, of course, as we started to see things change with politics across the border, all of a sudden, The Handmaid's Tale has been brought up regularly as a potential dark reality of the future of the US. Hopefully it won't come to that. And then there's the infertility crisis today. Fertility and infertility, whether it's positive or negative, has always been associated with women. I tried to research when male infertility really came up as a topic. And there were some studies on it, but clinics, medical conferences, these things did not start to happen until a few years ago. The first male fertility/infertility conferences only happened 5 or 6 years ago. Prior to that, given that it's man and woman that's creating a child, only the woman was looked at in terms of fertility. So looking at male infertility is something that's really new. And what often happens is there's this male problem or there's this female choice. So let's examine that a little bit. If we look at India and China, together, these two countries have 70 million more men than women. Traditionally, they're both cultures that are valuing boys over girls. China implemented the one-child policy, which really increased the rates of women actually not being born or being killed at birth, whatever it is, or abortions. A lot of crimes have been committed so that parents can have that one boy that they want. In India, same thing. That preference has been for boys over girls. So you see this significant disparity, and they're in really equal numbers. Each China and India have about 35 million extra men than women in each of their countries. And what does that do? What's the result of that? We have issues like human trafficking. We have increased prostitution. We have men that are growing depressed and lonely because there's no future potential for them to be in a relationship. You have more violence. There's even economic impacts. So looking at that disparity between the number of men and women in society has a lot of negative impacts on us. And then there's the infertility crisis of the Western world. Since 1981, in North America and Western Europe, male sperm count has declined by 50%. These are really big numbers. And nobody knows why. That's the biggest issue with this, is that nobody understands why. So you have declining sperm rates in the Western world, and then women and men are choosing to wait until they're older to have children, perhaps because of career or affordability, whatever it may be, people are waiting longer. There's a lot of people that are choosing not to have children. And then you have younger generations that are reportedly not having as much sex. So if you look at birth rates in the Western world, they're significantly declining. So from a dark history to a dark future. Babies have been born through IVF. Test tube babies have existed for some time now. And there's studies and predictions out there that, and they say this a lot, Western world. I don't really know what the hell's defined as Western world, but I'll just go with the quotes. The Western world is supposedly going to be having most babies in an artificial womb in another 50 years. With CRISPR, gene splicing. So the genetic engineering. What can this do? What can genetic engineering do? Aside from fighting disease and eliminating the susceptibility to certain illnesses, it also entirely can choose gender, eye color, hair color, skin color. There are a lot of different factors that come into play. By 2040, it could be common to produce eggs and sperm in a lab entirely. So on the optimistic side, let's eliminate all barriers and obstacles to people that can't have kids, people that can't conceive. All of a sudden, anyone can conceive. But there's dangers around this. What are the dangers around watching babies grow in a lab or in an incubator? Ethics, power, money, control, these all come into play. What happens in a world where people aren't as fertile? What happens to those that are fertile if they're identified? Depending on where you are in the world, fertility could be a choice that only the wealthy have. Reproduction could be a choice that only the wealthy have. If there are major crises around fertility, people can be kidnapped, women can be controlled, they can be held hostage. You could see this happening the same way you see it happening in film and in novels. There's a lot of darkness around the control of the future of humankind. Controlling fertility is controlling the future and society. The question is, are you safe? We might be today's humans, but what if the next generations start to become genetically enhanced? They're superior to us. All of a sudden, we are at risk at being tomorrow's invalids. And what's worse, that or this end? Thank you.